Hello, I'm Robert Royal, and these are the podcasts of The Catholic Thing. We're recording today from Rome on October 15, 2024, in the midst of the second session on the Synod on Synodality. Today is, of course, the feast day of St. Teresa of Avila, so we ask for her help in our conversation today. And we're very fortunate to have again with us, we've had him on before, Dr. Larry Chapp, who is a retired professor of theology. He taught for many years at DeSales University in Pennsylvania, and he is now running a Catholic worker farm in Pennsylvania. So Larry is a man of parts. He can do it all. He can think, he can work. Someday we may have to, when we're not doing the synod stuff, Larry, we'll have to dig into more about what your life is like and what opportunities there are for being a Catholic in the first quarter of the 21st century. But
I'd be happy to.
very grateful to have you with us today. So,
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
yeah. I ought to mention that we're both in apartments here in Rome, and as often happens in Rome, there's a lot of what they call restructuring going on, meaning that there's loud banging. So if you hear that, it's not because we're being attacked by some radical faction in the church or whatever, but it's just normal Roman noises that you'll be hearing.
Well, it's even worse now because they're getting ready for the Jubilee.
Right, yeah. And that should be fun next year. I was at the Jubilee in 2000, and it was really quite something. And they spruce up the city. You know, the churches get cleaned up, and the squares, they do the fountains and the statues and everything. So if anybody out there is planning on going to Rome, it's a good time next year to do it in the spring. And in fact, I'm going to be doing a couple of events. I have a new book coming out on the Catholic martyrs of the 21st century. I gave John Paul II a copy of my book, The Catholic Martyrs of the 20th Century, on May 7, 2020, and and Pope Francis has decided to do a similar event next year for the Jubilee year. So
that's great.
There'll be a lot of things that'll be going on, and at the Catholic Thing, we'll be telling people about that sort of thing. Larry, to get us started, you're a veteran of these synods. In fact, I think we got to know each other at a previous synod
last year.
Here, yeah, and. What I'd like to do is to just start with a very broad question. I want to get to some of the theological things that you've been writing, and I want to encourage people to read Larry. Every time I see that he's published something, I immediately read it and read it carefully, because not only is he aware of kind of the immediate events that are going on in the church and what they might portend, but he looks at it quite often from a deeper theological and even cultural standpoint. So I want to get to that eventually. But to begin with, I want to start with just a generalized question. You've been writing a daily diary, and I encourage people to go to that daily diary, which is at our friend's publication at First Things. First Things is a magazine located in New York. But let me just say, as a general introduction to this session, have you been surprised, because you've had experience and long experience with the church and with theology, have you been surprised by anything in particular to this point in the Synod?
I'm surprised by the fact that there doesn't seem to be a great deal that's new at this year's Synod. It seems simply like a repeat of last year, and it's a little disappointing in the sense that when you read the Instrumentum Laboris, issues that dominated at least the headlines at last year's Synod, LGBTQ, women's ordinations, was not in the Instrumentum Laboris. Instead, the Pope set up these other committees outside of the Synod to look into those things. And so I had hoped that the focus was not going to be on those things, and that there was really going to be a discussion of more specified of what is synodality. And yet, if you look at what's going on here in Rome, it seems as if no matter about these, that it's not an instrument of Boris, it seems like these questions keep pressing themselves forward. And I think one of the other things that has surprised me about this is that the Vatican doesn't seem to be too concerned about the fact that there's some actual lobbying that is going on by non-synodal groups that invite Synod members to come and so forth. So like James Martin, who is a Synod member, notice his outreach ministry, had a big gathering last week and invited Synod members, and apparently many of them showed up, and it was all a big LGBTQ happy fest advocacy group. And now I just read Jonathan Liedel in the National Catholic Register today, who says that a mailing has gone out to all Synod members, inviting them to a meeting of a pro-women's ordination group that's meeting tomorrow, and so on. And so this is all, I think, a very organized effort to keep these same issues that were hot button issues last year on the front burner, and in a sense, an attempt to influence the synod. I think that's a bad thing. I don't think it. The Pope has said to synod voters, don't talk about what's going on in the synod outside the hall. We want this free and open parrhesia inside the synod. And yet they haven't at the same time told synod members, please do not attend outside lobbying events by various pressure groups. That also prejudices things. So that's one of the things that has kind of surprised me, that in some sense these issues keep coming back.
Yeah. Yeah, some people have remarked on how present the Jesuits, and the Jesuits of a certain kind, obviously, are in operating the Synod as well, including the Holy Father, of course. Yeah, he's. I hadn't planned on talking about this, but since you brought it up, I mean, just the other day, he met with a group of, I think, 5 trans or who knows what kind of people who were brought by Sister Janine Gramick of New Ways Ministry, which is a very radical pro-LGBT organization,
Yes.
condemned multiple times by the church here in Rome and also our bishops in the United States. And to me, with a group like that, I mean, I think that to put the best face on it, I think that what he constantly thinks he's doing is he's meeting with the tax collectors and prostitutes, and he's just being a welcoming person. That's the best construal of what he's been doing. But actually, I think what for most people it says, and he does this right in the middle of the synod, is we're welcoming these people here. And the conversations, the conversation at the Jesuit house about LGBT, there was an intervention by Bishop Stephen Chow from Hong Kong in which he said in a prayer to God to help us overcome our ignorance and our prejudices. Well, what is our ignorance? I mean, I think we all know what LGBT is at this point, and we know what they want.
Yeah.
And so what is our prejudice? Is it Catholic teaching about sexuality that's an actual prejudice? I mean, certainly a pope meeting with a group like that right in the midst of a synod in which that issue is not supposed to be discussed. Puts a cat among pigeons.
You see what they mean by prejudice. I think it's very clear. Cardinal Hollerich, of course, last year, the general relator of the synod, openly dissents from church teaching on homosexuality, said that one of the reasons why he dissents from the teaching is that the teaching is rooted in an antiquated science, bad science. And I think what they mean by that is that people are born this way, they don't choose to be gay and all this sort of thing, and therefore we need to alter our teaching to reflect these new scientific realities. I think that's what they mean. And so obviously when the Bishop Chow says, we have to overcome our prejudices, I think what he means is we need to change church teaching to be more grounded in this so-called science. So that's I think what's going on with it. But you're right, these photo ops that the Pope is granting, yes, best spin is to say, oh, it's accompaniment. He's just accompanying people. But as I said in a post on X the other day, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, I said, at what point do these various photo ops that are an effort at accompaniment, at what point do they cross over from accompaniment and cross the line into empowerment and approval? And that's a question that has to be asked. All right. It's one thing to meet with people. It's another thing to in a sense remain silent as to what it is that they stand for. And I think that's a tremendous. And then of course too, and there's very clearly on the part of this Pope an effort to rehabilitate New Ways Ministry and Sister Gramick. He sent her 2 private letters last year, as well as granted her a private audience. And so many words say, oh, I know you've suffered, and I approve of your ministry. Approve of your ministry? She openly dissents from church teachings on these issues. So, and also, by the way, Janet Smith has pointed out, to her credit, that one of the people that was in that group of transit was a surgeon who has engaged in sex reassignment surgeries, even for minors. So present in the Pope's presence was someone who is a surgical butcher, a mutilator of children. And for the Pope to grant her a platform like I think is unconscionable. I think it's grossly irresponsible.
I mean, it's also incoherent because the Vatican put out a document, Dignitas Infinita, just a short
Yes.
while ago, in which trans operations were condemned. That this was an affront against the sexuality that God has given each of us when we were conceived and then when we were born. Yeah, I mean, this is this ongoing incoherence that there seem to be multiple messages, and I think that strangely, it's an effort to bring everybody together. But what happens, and I think that this is a hallmark of the Pope's entire history as a leader in the church, is he leaves everybody angry because on the one hand, he kind of gives you the impression that he's orthodox by condemning trans surgeries, and then on the other
Yeah.
hand, he meets with people who are trans and gives them the impression. In fact, I think several of them came out of that meeting and said, "Well, he was very open to to what we were talking about." And then when there isn't a resolution of this, people on both sides are very angry with him because they feel like they've been led astray. They've been led to believe one thing and something else happens as a result of it. It's a very odd
Yeah, it
situation.
is, I think incoherent is the right word, but I would also question whether or not he really is bringing everyone together. I
Yeah,
mean, there are factions of the church that he clearly disfavors. And
yeah,
let's just leave it at that. And they don't get invited. Isn't it instructive? James Martin is a voting member of the Synod, but the president of Courage International is not. New
right.
Way's ministry gets a photo op with the Pope with transgenders. The Ministry of Courage gets no photo op. So there is an omission there. And of course, he never talks to traditionalists, people who love the old Latin Mass. He doesn't bring them onto the table. They're indiatrists, backwardists. They're just to be swept aside.
Right. I want to get to some deeper theological issues, but before we do, just one last kind of general question. I surprised myself the other day. I actually was looking at some of the participants, some of the delegates in the synod, and I felt a certain sympathy for them because it's
Yeah,
my perception. Tell me if I'm wrong about this, actually, but it's my perception that most of these people, I think people who are not here in Rome or are not familiar with these synods, they kind of see the things that we've been talking about, these hot button issues, and they think it's kind of an ideological organization. But most of the delegates, I think a very large percentage, large majority actually, are really kind of decent people. They mean well. They've been working in the church. Um, they would like to find some ways to be more effective in their ministries in the church. And they come here and they have to start using this language. And one of the things I noticed at one of the recent press conferences is they were using this language that you and I are very familiar with. I don't know if our audience is, about a church, a synodal church in mission. Whatever that means. We never know what any of these
yeah,
buzz phrases mean in this synod. A synodal church in mission. But as I was listening to them talk about what they understood that to be, it seemed to me that it was more like the old idea of becoming missionaries, which is a great thing. I mean, what is the mission of the church? I mean, obviously, it's to bring
yeah,
as many people to heaven as possible. That's what the Lord came to do when he was incarnate on earth. So the mission should be preaching the gospel to all nations, and yet the
yes.
church in mission seems to be this inward-looking mission. How are we going to talk? There's going to be a
Yeah,
synodal style. So I think that there's a certain disconnect even there within the synod, that people really understand what it is to be more in terms of traditional ideas of Catholicism, but yet they're forced to use this language, almost like, we've talked about this before, these struggle sessions in communist China and the Soviet Union and whatnot. They use this
yeah.
terminology that has become synodal terminology, but I don't think that the delegates in general are as much on board with what I would even call the ideology of the synod as appears sometimes from the outside. What do you think of that?
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, in 2013, Jorge Bergoglio gave a speech right before he was elected where he said, we have to avoid a self-referential church. We need a church that goes out to the periphery, smells like the sheep. And yet, could there be a more self-referential thing than this synod on synodality? One really has to labor to connect very disparate dots to say that all of this discussion of the internal governing structure of the church somehow relates to the missional aspects of the church going out to the world. It is a huge stretch. And I agree with that. I don't think a lot of synod members are really on board with a lot of this. I know from talking to some synod members, I won't mention their names, of course, that in reality, the entire process is exhausting. From sun up to sundown, they're in there and they're listening to talk after talk after talk after talk. And all of this sort of verbiage about inclusion and dialogue and listening and blah blah blah, the kind of verbiage that one can get out of a human resources department in any major U.S. or any European corporation. This is just human resources kind of stuff, and it's boring. And a bit, as one person told me, it's a bit infantilizing. And so, yeah, I agree with. I think a lot of the synod members are really, really good people, most of them, and I just think that there's a lot of frustration there. I will say this though, uh, one of the more important things, and maybe this will create something of interest for the synod members that they can really sink their teeth into because it's quite particular. One of the things that they're going to be discussing, I think beginning today, is the granting of doctrinal authority to national Episcopal conferences.
Right.
We,
Yeah.
we can talk about LGBTQ, we can talk about women's ordination, but this is really the major issue that could eventually come out of this synod. We're not going to get gay marriage in the church. We're not going to get women's ordination, but we could get changes to canon law at the end of this synod, and certainly a certain theology that grants. The thing they're going to be debating today is whether or not national Episcopal conferences are what they call ecclesial subjects in their own right. And therefore have the right for making doctrinal decisions. The Germans are salivating over this. This is what they've been waiting for, So what is true in Germany may not be true in Poland, and this is the real danger that's involved here. I think.
Yeah, the Germans have been very quiet at this synod, and I think they're just laying low for a moment like this, the one that you're talking about. Listen, since you raised the question of theology, I wanted to get to some theological points that you raised in your recent diaries. I was very taken by the one you did the other day, in which you were talking about one cannot but be amazed by the outsized influence of Europeans at the Synod, since the dioceses they represent constitute a living witness to what should not be done pastorally. They've been failing by liberalizing. But here's the theological point that I would like you to expand on a little and explain to our audience what this actually means. You said, it is a call about the general idea of the Synod. It is a call for a return to the proportionalist moral theologies that were definitively rejected by Pope John Paul II in Veritatis Splendor. What this amounts to, as we saw in past iterations of these theologies, I think it says, is a baptizing of a sexual revolution, and in part a reducing of all moral decision making to a consideration of quote unquote lived experience in all our complex circumstances, also in quotes. In other words, and to stay on my main point, it is a call for a radical shift away from the church's perennial teachings grounded in natural law and toward a more capacious embrace of the sexual values of modern secularity. I think most of our audience understand that it's going in the direction of modern secularity. But what is this proportionalist? I mean, you and I are familiar with that term, but I'm not sure our audience generally is.
Yeah, it's a moral theory that arose primarily in the 60s and 70s. That was sort of its heyday, and it really caught fire after the coming of Humanae Vitae and the massive theological dissent from Humanae Vitae on the issue of contraception. So, this whole theological movement began in moral theology called proportionalism or consequentialism that said there are no intrinsically evil actions. There's nothing that's inherently always immoral in every circumstance because circumstances define the morality or immorality of an act. That's a bit simplistic, but that's sort of, it's a version of situation ethics that nothing's morally absolute and you have to look at circumstances. And of course, John Paul II fought hard against this. Many moral theologians of happy memory, guys like Dr. Germain Grisey, who I studied under, fought against it. And it was kind of effectively suppressed in veritatis splendor, at least on the magisterial level. But now it's rearing its head again. And it reared its head in one of the committees that Pope Francis developed outside of the Synod, but the Synod members want to hear about it, was a committee devoted to studying controverted and controversial moral theological issues. That committee issued its report at the beginning of the Synod, and on October 18th, they're going to give a bigger, broader version of it to the Synod participants, and what that committee has already said is that, well, we have to look at lived circumstances. We have to look at concrete circumstances. There's no one-size-fits-all morality. We can't begin with settled truths and then deduce from that how individuals ought to act. And in reality, when you unpack that, what they mean is we need to revamp sexual morality. That's what they mean. Because nobody talks about, well, we have to take a second look at rape, or a second look at genocide, or a second look at murder, or a second look at lying, or stealing, or cheating on your wife or your husband, or whatever, adultery. Well, no, what we need to look at are issues in the sexual domain where the values of modern society have radically altered the equation. And so pastors on the ground are dealing with cohabitating couples before marriage, contracepting couples, and then of course, there's the whole LGBTQ framework to consider, and so that's what this attempted revision of moral theology, I think, is really going after, and I think most pundits would agree with that.
Yeah. Well, just to say to our audience, this is the infamous Group 9 of these study groups that are supposed to
Yes.
be studying specific questions, and they're going to report on them. They're going to issue at least in theory, their final reports are going to come out in June of 2025. And so those issues that were supposedly taken off the table for the actual Synod sessions and are being studied in these groups, it's Group 9 to keep your eyes out for. Let me move on to another point, because we're getting a little long at this point. You expressed in your diary entry the other day some frustration at both the progressives who are heading down this path that we've been discussing and the traditionalists. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, the progressivism is clearly a dead end. And I spend most of my time criticizing them simply because they're the ones who are kind of in charge of things, apparently, right now in so many ways. And traditionalists are a minority in the church, and so I tend not to criticize them too much. But nevertheless, there's criticism there because they agree with us in a sense that modern secularity is a kind of dead end in terms of accommodating to it as a pastoral practice. Their reaction to that then is that, well, let's go all scorched earth. Let's simply reject the modern world. Let's go back before Vatican II. Let's just everyone go back to the old Latin Mass. Let's go back to the old Thomistic manuals for doing theology. And they cast aspersions as well at Vatican II and the papacies of John Paul and Benedict. Not a few traditionalists, especially if you look at social media. You throw the name John Paul II out there, and it's like red meat to wolves. They immediately pounce. They immediately go after John Paul. There's this whole effort, in a sense, to redefine John Paul as a modernist in their eyes.
Yeah, a Novus Ordo Pope.
The Novus Ordo Pope,
the
Pope who went to Assisi and prayed with the Buddhists and the Hindus, the Pope who kissed the Koran, and so on and so on and so on. But you and I both know, because we lived through his papacy, that this is, of course, utter nonsense, that John Paul was a modernist. But nevertheless, that's why I think the traditionalist answer is equally problematic, and we have to envision Yes, new ways. I know that sounds bizarre, but new ways of being orthodox in the church that are faithful to tradition, but aren't, in a sense, slaves to certain Baroque Renaissance forms of the faith as the be all and end all of how the church is to be.
Let me quote you one more time before we close. You told a story in your diary the other day about a nun that you met here. And you said about that meeting and that conversation with her that average Catholics, in quotation, simply do not care about Synod 2024. They do not know what it is, or in most cases, even that it is. She stated, the nun, that the concerns of most hidden underneath their opinions on various issues are the perennial concerns to see in the church something supernatural, something of God, and something that shows that Christ is indeed real and alive. But is our synodal listening attuned to this tonality, the tones of the supernatural? I found that very striking. And I've been noticing myself that the idea of holiness seems to have dropped out of
Oh.
synodal consideration. It's as if it's all a matter of issues and processes and whatnot. And I'm not saying everything ought to be about personal holiness, but it's certainly a personal holiness and a spiritual understanding of the church is, of course, important.
Yeah,
Please.
well, for a synod that wants to quote Vatican II all the time, especially in invoking this notion of the people of God, which I think they falsely identify with the laity. That's not what Vatican II meant by the people of God. Nevertheless, Vatican II also, in Lumen Gentium, had the universal call to holiness sort of front and center in the document. But there's almost this sense of, well, you don't want to emphasize the pursuit of sanctity too much as the central core vocation of every layperson in religious industry, because that might make people feel bad about themselves. That might give the impression of a church that's obsessed with sin and wrongdoing and so on. We want to be more positive. I don't. This is obviously we want to be a church that does accompany sinners and is compassionate towards sinners. Obviously,
Sure.
I don't think anybody would disagree with that. I'm totally in favor of that. But there's an accompaniment that also leads somewhere. I mean, that's the purpose to accompany it, to bring people to repentance and Christ and holiness and so on. But there's very, very little emphasis of that here at the Synod in its documents, in its conversations. It's almost as if it's been deliberately sidebarred for some reason. But the nun made that very clear. I mean, I don't want to say who she is because she was very adamant that I not mention her name or anything like that because she's worked in Rome for years. But she works in a place where she sees all kinds of people. It's a public place, and she said, "Look, most Catholics don't give a darn about this synod on synodality, not at all."
Well, we need these anecdotes because otherwise all we are going to do is follow sort of official
Yeah,
conceptions of what's going on in the church, and of course that is going to be very limited too. I want to end with just one observation because I was very touched by the story in your diary entry about your wife going to pray at the tomb of Saint Monica, the mother of the great Saint Augustine, and how you
yeah.
posted a photo of her on one of your outlets, and that it's
Facebook.
the
Yeah,
largest. Yeah, it was the largest response that you had ever gotten. There's your wife praying for all sorts of people. We all get requests from people to pray for them when we're here in Rome. And I
yeah,
just thought that was a hopeful way to kind of end this conversation because, look, it may not be a huge number within the church, but there are people who still believe that it matters that we're faithful and we humble ourselves and go and pray in front of the tombs of great saints like St. Monica or St. Augustine. Um, has that been a
yeah.
common experience with you? I'm just curious.
Yeah, yeah, it is. I find that this is a note of hope. Despite all the problems in the church, there is still an enormous, even in Western cultures, there's still an enormous reservoir of faith, an enormous thirst for the supernatural. Because darn it, the gospel is true. And since the gospel is true, we do have souls that are carved out, a hollow spot in our soul for God and thirst after God. And you can engage in all these theological abstractions, but when the rubber meets the road, people care about their kids. They care about their loved ones. They care about their friends. And if they're people of faith, they care about the faith of those people. And that came out loud and clear in that Facebook post where I showed my wife praying at the tomb of St. Monica. And the number one prayer request we get when we come to Rome is for people asking us, because they know we go to the tomb of St. Monica, asking us to pray for their children. And I
Yeah.
think that's very telling. And so I would hope that the synod. I do know that the loudest applause that was given to any synod speech so far, according to reports, was applause from a speech a woman gave where she talked about the need to look into how we initiate young people into the church. I
Yeah.
thought that was very hopeful.
I heard that rumor too, that she said that, how do I bring up my kids, my grandkids to remain
Yeah,
faithful in a culture
yeah.
like this? Well, Larry, thank you very much. Your insights are always wonderful. I want to say again to our audience that anywhere that Larry appears, really rush to it. You've got a podcast site yourself that they can go to,
Yeah,
right?
a
Is that
blog,
correct?
podcast, Gaudi. It's long-winded. GaudiumEtSpes22.com, which is a Vatican II
Yeah, it's not
document.
that long. Gaudium et Spes 22. Good. That's great. Okay.
Yeah.
And let me just say again, as we close, that this is a podcast of the Catholic Thing, which is a daily column series, and I mean column, not long articles, a 1,000 word column. So you can read that column with one as you're having your first cup of coffee in the morning or whenever. And you can subscribe for free at www.thecatholicthing.org. So, Larry, we hope to have you back sometime very soon,
Thank you.
as we hope to have our audience back sometime very soon, and we'll see everyone again very soon.